Anderson escorted the Confederate officers to the wharf, where he shook hands with each of them in turn as they climbed into their boat. Captain Lee was the last to embark, and as he did, Anderson saluted and said, "If we never meet in this world again, God grant that we may meet in the next." He watched their boat disappear into the darkness before returning to the fort. He had a short conference with his officers, telling them he would not return fire until daylight, as he had no wish to waste ammunition. He then ordered them to go round the fort and tell the men, many of whom were still up, what was happening, and to either go back to bed or stay under cover. Reveille would be sounded at the same time as normal, when they could eat breakfast. After this, the garrison would be divided into 2 reliefs, each having a tour of duty at the guns of 4 hours. Some of the officers went up to the barbette for one last look around the harbor before the bombardment began. Everywhere they looked, Confederate campfires flickered. From Morris Island in the south, right round to Sullivan's Island in the north, the only gap in this circle was to the east, where it was broken by the harbor mouth. The boat carrying the Confederate aides from Sumter headed straight to Fort Johnson on James Island, some 1.25 miles distance. Here they were met by Captain George S. James, who was in command of the battery. James was bursting with anticipation as to whether or not they'd been successful in their negotiations with Major Anderson, but he was kept in suspense until everyone was safely inside the fort, where Colonel Chestnut gave the captain the order he'd been waiting for, telling him to have the signal gun fired at 4:20 a.m. Captain James immediately issued orders to have his command aroused, those, that is, that were not already awake and full of excitement. Soon the old fort was full of activity as gunners took their place at the cannons. The signal itself, that would confirm hostilities were about to begin, was to be fired by a seacoast mortar, already loaded and aimed. The question was, who was going to fire it? Who was going to fire this, the first shot of the war? Captain James offered the honor to the Virginian Senator Roger A. Pryor, who had fought so hard and so long for the blow that was about to be struck. Pryor had always been strongly in favor of secession and had preached ceaselessly that once the first shot was fired, Virginia would be forced to join the Confederacy. But Pryor refused to fire the gun. Captain Lee noticed that Pryor was behaving in much the same fashion as Major Anderson had done. This outspoken man, well known for his fiery oratory, was also deeply moved by the turn of events. Before the question of who would fire the first shot was solved, the party that had visited Sumter took their leave of Captain James, as they still had to report the outcome of their meeting to General Beauregard. After watching them depart, James returned inside the fort. He was rather annoyed that his magnanimous gesture to Senator Pryor had been turned down, so he casually ordered Lieutenant Henry S. Farley to fire the gun. Lieutenant Farley stood next to the 8-inch mortar, gripping the lanyard tightly in his hand. It was now a few minutes past 4:20 a.m. The signal was going to be late. His mouth was dry, and his hand quivered slightly in the chill. He could feel the eyes of all the other men, now ready at their posts, watching him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and jerked the lanyard. There was a flash as bright as daylight and a deep roar as the charge of powder sent the shell on its way towards Fort Sumter. All eyes watched the arc of the flickering red fuse as it climbed on its trajectory upwards till it seemed to stop for a second, just hanging in space before it plunged down again. At about 100 feet above the fort it exploded, illuminating Sumter for a few seconds in an eerie light before all was dark again. Yet the echo of this explosion remained in everyone's ears all around the harbor. Some cheered, some cried, others prayed. The echo of this first gun was not to stop at Charleston Harbor. It vibrated all the way across the split country, to every city, town, and village. It was soon to reach the 2 capitals, Washington and Montgomery, where the seeds of war had been sown by 2 sons of Kentucky, Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Captain Doubleday wrote about the commencement of hostilities. "We have not been in the habit of regarding the signal shell fired from Fort Johnson as the first gun of the conflict, although it was undoubtedly aimed at Fort Sumter. Edmund Ruffin of Virginia is usually credited with the opening of the attack by firing the first gun from the ironclad battery on Morris Island. The ball from that gun struck the wall of the magazine where I was lying, penetrated the masonry, and burst very near my head. As the smoke from this explosion came in through the ventilators of the magazine, and the floor was strewn with powder where the flannel cartridges had been filled, I thought for a moment that the place was on fire. When it was fully light, we took breakfast leisurely before going to the guns. Our food consisted of pork and water." Some records of events say they had coffee. After breakfast, the men were divided into 2 reliefs by Anderson. Each would take a tour of duty at the guns for 4 hours. Captain Doubleday, being senior, took the first tour. He divided his own men into 3 parties. The first, under his own command, would fire upon the guns on Morris Island. The second, under Lieutenant J.C. Davis, manned the guns bearing on the Jamestown Island batteries. And the third, without an officer, had the batteries on Sullivan's Island as a target. This included the floating ironclad battery that had taken up position at the western end of that island. Major Anderson had ordered that only the guns in the lower tier were to be used. These were the 32 and 42-pounders that only fired solid shot. Captain Doubleday's men began to return fire from Sumter at about 7:30 a.m., with Doubleday himself firing the first shot. In history, Abner Doubleday is remembered far more for his development of the game of baseball than he is for firing the first shot on the Union side in the Civil War. The gunners in Doubleday's third party fired for over an hour at the floating ironclad battery some mile in distance from them. They were disappointed to see that when they did manage to hit it, their shot just bounced off. So they turned their attention to their old home Fort Moultrie, now with its guns remounted. Again, it was frustrating for them to see that when they did get in an accurate shot, they were still doing little damage. The guns they were forced to use by Major Anderson were just too light. As the hours passed, a crowd of spectators could be seen gathering on Sullivan's Island beach. These onlookers were well out of the line of fire as they picnicked and drank wine while watching with some enthusiasm the duel between Sumter and Moultrie. 2 sergeants in Sumter found the presence of this crowd, who were obviously unsympathetic towards them, objectionable. So, when no officers were watching, they turned 2 42-pounders on them and fired. Nobody on the beach was hit, but as the shots flew over their heads, the crowd were seen making a hasty and undignified retreat for cover, much to the satisfaction of the 2 NCOs. As the day drew on, neither side was having much effect on each other. Sumter was hit time and time again, but with no real damage to its walls, and no major casualties had been caused to either side. While Anderson only permitted the use of his smaller guns on the lower tier, their effect on the Confederate batteries was minimal. His reasons for not wanting to fire the much larger guns up on the exposed third tier, or terraplane, were probably twofold. First, the men firing them would be unprotected from incoming shells and shot. Second, he was trying to prevent too many casualties in the crews of the Confederate batteries. One man in the company, however, didn't share Major Anderson's desire to preserve rebel lives. His name was Carmody. While nobody was looking, he climbed up onto the ramparts and fired all the heavy guns facing Fort Moultrie in succession. They had already been aimed and loaded, so all Carmody had to do was pull the lanyards. The Confederates, thinking Anderson was about to start using his heavy batteries and realizing the danger, increased their own fire, sweeping the terraplane in the hope of sending the Federal gunners diving for cover. Carmody, not being able to reload the guns alone, quickly retreated. His single-handed fight with the rebels ending in a draw, neither side having suffered casualties. The two sergeants that had earlier fired on the crowd on the beach now wanted to fire the 10-inch Columbiad on the barbette facing the iron battery at Cummings Point. Making sure no officers could see them, they went up to the barbette where the gun was already loaded and aimed. The first shot they fired just missed their target, passing over the crest of the battery. With a little less elevation, they thought they could destroy it. They reloaded the gun, an extremely difficult undertaking for two men, especially as they were now coming under heavy fire as the Confederates had turned every gun that would bear towards them. One of the sergeants went a little way down the spiral stairs to make sure the major was still out of his way, while his partner remained lying on the barbette floor, shells passing above his head uncomfortably close. Not wanting to wait any longer, he fired the cannon. With a huge roar, the charge sent the 128-pound shot towards the rebel battery. It also caused the heavy gun to leap off its carriage, turn a somersault in the air, and fall down over the entrance to the stairs just as the other NCO was coming back up, giving him the fright of his life. The shot, however, was very accurate and hit the iron battery just below a central embrasure, half covering it with sand. The two sergeants returned downstairs undiscovered, swearing eternal secrecy about their exploits. As night fell, Major Anderson was worried that the fleet waiting outside the harbor might send in reinforcements, or the enemy might try an assault. Captain Chester wrote about both possibilities. Both would answer in English if challenged. It would be horrible to fire upon friends. It would be fatal not to fire upon enemies. The night was dark and chilly. Shells were dropping into the fort at regular intervals, and the men were tired, hungry, and out of temper. Any party that approached that night would have been rated as enemies. Gustavus Fox on the liner Baltic had arrived early on the 12th April and met with the warship Pawnee and the revenue cutter Harriet Lane a dozen miles east of Charleston Harbor. Fox had sailed down from New York in terrible weather, and most of the soldiers on board who were to be transferred to Sumter were suffering from seasickness. Fox was still unaware that the Powhatan, the most powerful warship in his fleet, had sailed with new orders for Pensacola, and nobody knew where the Pocahontas was. Fox decided to act at once, signaling the captain of the Pawnee, saying he was going to reprovision Sumter and he wanted an escort. Commander Stephen C. Rowan of the Pawnee refused to go along with Fox, saying his orders were to wait for the Powhatan, and if he tried to escort the Baltic on his own, it might start a civil war. Neither Fox or Rowan knew that the shooting had already started a few hours earlier. Fox decided to try it alone with only the Harriet Lane for an escort, and the two ships sailed off towards the bar. Soon Fox could hear the rumble of gunfire in the distance. In the air was the unmistakable smell of powder smoke. Realizing that he was too late, and that the war had already started, he ordered the Baltic and Harriet Lane to hove to while he decided what to do. In the meantime, Commander Rowan of the Pawnee came alongside and asked for a pilot, saying he was going into the harbor and share in the fate of his brethren in the army. Fox went aboard the Pawnee and persuaded Rowan to wait, insisting that with the additional guns of the Powhatan and the Pocahontas, they would be able to force the harbor entrance and relieve Sumter. They would just have to wait for their arrival. As dawn broke over Sumter on the second day of the bombardment, the garrison ate breakfast and began to return fire again at about 7:30. By 9 o'clock, fires had broken out in the officers' quarters, been extinguished and broken out again in several other places. It was realized that the Confederates were firing red-hot shot, and the fires were left to burn. James Chester wrote, "The scene inside the fort as the fire gained headway and threatened the magazine was an exciting one. It had already reached some of our stores of loaded shells and shell grenades. These must be saved at all hazard. Soldiers brought their blankets and covered the precious projectiles, and thus the most of them were saved. But the magazine itself was in danger. Already it was full of smoke, and the flames were rapidly closing in upon it. It was evident that it must be closed, and it would be many hours before it could be opened again. During these hours, our fire must be maintained with such powder as we could secure outside the magazine. A number of barrels were rolled out for this purpose, and the magazine door, already almost too hot to handle, was closed. It was the intention to store the powder taken from the magazine in several safe corners, covering it with damp soldiers' blankets. But safe corners were hard to find, and most of the blankets were already in use covering loaded shell. The fire was raging more fiercely than ever, and safety demanded that the uncovered powder be thrown overboard. This was instantly done, and if the tide had been high, we should have been rid of it. But the tide was low, and the pile of powder barrels resting on the rip-wrapping in front of the embrasure. This was observed by the enemy, and some shell guns were turned upon the pile, producing an explosion which blew the gun at that embrasure clear out of the battery, but did no further damage. The fire had now enveloped the magazine, and the danger of an explosion was imminent. Powder had been carried out all the previous day, and it was more than likely that enough had sifted through the cartridge bags to carry the fire into the powder chamber. Major Anderson, his head erect as if on parade, called the men around him, directed that a shot be fired every 5 minutes, and mentioned that there was some danger of the magazine exploding. Some of the men, as soon as they learned what the real danger was, rushed to the door of the magazine and hurriedly dug a trench in front of it, which they kept filled with water until the danger was considered over. Captain Stephen D. Lee of the Confederate Army wrote, "No material change was noticed till 8 a.m. on the 13th, when the barracks in Fort Sumter were set on fire by hot shot from the guns of Fort Moultrie. As soon as this was discovered, the Confederate batteries redoubled their efforts to prevent the fire being extinguished. Fort Sumter fired at little longer intervals to enable the garrison to fight the flames. This brave action under such a trying ordeal aroused great sympathy and admiration on the part of the Confederates for Major Anderson and his gallant garrison. This feeling was shown by cheers whenever a gun was fired from Sumter. It was also shown by the loud reflections on the men of war outside the harbor." At 12:30, under a hail of shot from every direction, the flag above the fort was shot down. General Beauregard, thinking that Anderson might have surrendered, sent 3 aides by boat to offer the major assistance with the fires. These were William Porcher Miles, Roger A. Pryor, and Captain Stephen D. Lee. In a second boat, Colonel Chisholm, who was aide to the governor, had also started out for Sumter, and in a third, ex-Senator Colonel Wigfall, whose journey was completely unauthorized, was also heading for the fort. Wigfall was an aide-de-camp of Beauregard's, but he hadn't seen the general in days. Shortly after these 3 boats had started out across the harbor, they saw the national flag raised again above Sumter. 2 of them immediately turned about and started back for Charleston. Only Colonel Wigfall, in his small skiff, rowed by a slave, ignored the newly raised flag and kept going. Under a white handkerchief attached to his sword, he approached the fort. Captain James Chester recalled, "It came the turn of one of the guns on the left face of the work to fire. We were now firing once in 5 minutes, and as the cannoneer approached for the purpose of loading, he discovered a man looking in at the embrasure. A short but lively altercation ensued between the man and the cannoneer, the man pleading to be taken in lest he be killed with his own shot and shell. He was soon hauled in, Thompson, the cannoneer, first receiving his sword, to the point of which a white handkerchief was attached. Once inside, the bearer asked to see Major Anderson. The major was soon on the spot and opened the conversation by asking, 'To what am I indebted for this visit?' The visitor replied, 'I am Colonel Wigfall of General Beauregard's staff. For God's sake, Major, let this thing stop. There's been enough bloodshed already.' To which the major replied, 'There has been none on my side, and besides, your batteries are still firing on me.' At which Wigfall exclaimed, 'I'll soon stop that.' And turning to Thompson, who still held the sword under his arm, he said, pointing at the handkerchief, 'Wave that out there.' Thompson then handed the sword back to Wigfall, saying in substance, wave it yourself. Long negotiations took place between Anderson and Colonel Wigfall, who offered the major more or less the same terms for leaving the fort as had been offered to him on the night of the 11th. Anderson felt he had no other choice than to accept, and ordered a white sheet to be displayed above the fort. As the fire from the shore slowly ceased, Wigfall left in his boat to report the contents of his meeting to Beauregard. Shortly after Wigfall's departure, another boat arrived at the fort, this time carrying Miles, Pryor, and Captain Lee. Anderson met them, saying, "Gentlemen, do I understand you come direct from General Beauregard?" "Yes," was their reply. Anderson then said, "Why, Colonel Wigfall has just been as an aide to and by the authority of General Beauregard, and proposed the same terms of evacuation offered on the 11th instant." Anderson was informed that Wigfall, though an aide of Beauregard's, had not seen the general for a few days and was not authorized to offer Anderson terms. Major Anderson became annoyed at the stupidity of the situation, saying, "There is a misunderstanding on my part, and I will at once run up my flag and open fire again." Anderson was persuaded to delay this action, being asked to put in writing the terms he would accept. This note the three gentlemen proposed to take to Beauregard with their assurances that the general would accept them. Before they left the fort, however, another boat arrived, this time carrying Major D.R. Jones, Assistant Adjutant General on Beauregard's staff. He was able to offer Anderson more or less the same terms as had been offered him on the 11th and again by Colonel Wigfall. Jones' offer was accepted by Anderson, and the fort surrendered on 13th April, 1861. Outside the harbor with his small fleet, Gustavus Fox was still trying to plan how he was going to reinforce Sumter, when he was told that a white flag had been raised over the fort. It was all over. All Fox could do now was wait off the bar until he could arrange to take Anderson and his men back to New York. The next day, the 14th, Anderson and his men were given permission to fire a 100-gun salute to their flag before marching out of the fort. Captain Doubleday wrote of this ceremony, "To fire the salute was very dangerous and difficult to do, for owing to the recent conflagration there were fire and sparks all around the cannon, and it was not easy to find a safe place of deposit for the cartridges. It happened that some flakes of fire had entered the muzzle of one of the guns after it was sponged. Of course, when the gunner attempted to ram the cartridge down, it exploded prematurely, killing Private Daniel Huff instantly and setting fire to a pile of cartridges underneath, which also exploded, seriously wounding 5 other men. Subsequently, only 50 guns were fired in the salute." Daniel Huff, plus one of the wounded who was to die later, were the only 2 soldiers to die during the whole affair, in which over 4,000 shots and shells had been fired. And, ironically, this happened after the fighting had stopped. Huff was buried in the fort, and the new Confederate garrison joined with the Federal soldiers to show their respects during a moving ceremony. With banners flying, the Federal soldiers marched out of Fort Sumter for the last time, drums beating as the band played Yankee Doodle. They boarded the transport which had been supplied to take them out to the steamship Baltic, which was anchored outside the harbor. Once on board, they were soon on their way to New York, where they received a rapturous welcome, being seized and forced to ride on the shoulders of the crowd. The Chamber of Commerce gave each of the officers and men a bronze medal in appreciation of their bravery. Over the days that followed, they were besieged with visitors wanting to hear every detail of their ordeal. With the war now on, the men from the fort were not to remain in New York for long. The 2 companies from Sumter soon found themselves on their way, under Captain Doubleday's command, to reinforce General Patterson's column, which was to serve in the Shenandoah Valley. The day after Major Anderson's men left Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for 75,000 militia from the loyal states to preserve the Union, making it quite clear to the people in the Southern Confederacy that he intended to fight. The loss of Sumter was to start a civil war which would cost the lives of over 600,000, mainly young men. The Stars and Stripes was not to fly over Fort Sumter again until the 14th April, 1865. With the then General Anderson in the presence of many of the officers that had served with him during the bombardment, hauled up the very same flag that had been taken down exactly 4 years before. On this day, too, in a Washington theater, Abraham Lincoln was shot and mortally wounded.